Hello, thank you for that introduction to what we do at the Centre for Social Impact. And I'd like to welcome everyone to today's public seminar series. We hold these every month, and this month you'll hear from Dr. Lindy Bain, and this has been incredibly popular. There's been lots and lots of registrations. And I can understand why. Today, Lindy Bain will be talking about the world of ESG, sustainability reporting and practices. And I guess it's something that I don't know a whole heap about. What I do know, it's all very aspirational and feels big, but in my conversations with Lindy, she's able to keep it quite grounded and practical. And she's said she invites any questions today. She's happy, no matter where you are on this journey, to answer just anything at all. So keep that in mind while you listen to Lindy. I'll just say, firstly, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people today, and we respect the elders past and present and recognise the continuing connection they have to the lands and waters in Perth. So feel free to put the lands that you're coming from in chat, because I know we have people from all over Australia at least here today. With that important acknowledgement done, I'd also like to quickly introduce Dr. Lindy Bain. She's a senior lecturer at the UWA Business School. She's a qualified chartered accountant, and she's had 20 years experience as a sustainability researcher and an accounting lecturer. So she really does bring those two worlds together. She's currently the chair of the ANZ Sustainability Working Group WA, and she's known for her sort of practical approach in this space, which I'm sure is the reason why you're all here today. So today I will hand over to Lindy shortly, and as I said, she is open to questions throughout. If there's a burning question that's just about the content as we move along, I'll keep an eye on the chat for those. Other than that, we'll listen to Lindy's presentation and know that at the end we'll take questions either on chat, but always we prefer you to have your questions spoken and on camera directly to Lindy if that's possible. So without further ado, over to you, Lindy.
Thanks so much, Lizette. And thanks so much for the invitation and for all of you for joining. I'm so excited. If there's ever a need for multidisciplinary teams, this certainly is it. So I'm just going to share my slides here. Right, so this is what we're going to be talking about today. So before we get into it, I just want to talk about some basic ideas that I think we all need to consider as we go along this journey, whether you're beginning or whether you've been doing sustainability practices and reporting for many years. And that is that no one of us can know everything about this sustainability or ESG. We definitely need multidisciplinary teams. So Carol, when you're ready, you can launch your poll just to see who's in the room with us today. You know, do you see yourself as an accountant or an engineer or a biologist or a social impacts person, HR? We'd love to hear who we have in the room today. The other thing with this journey is just, you know, we often get a bit overwhelmed if we just don't know everything about everything. So progress over perfection is something that we can always bear in mind. And that's also when we worried about, for example, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions that are hard to measure. We don't need to wait for perfect data to do something right now. If it's even just turning off the lights, getting your kids to delete some old emails, pictures that we're not using a lot of energy to store digital old emails, that can save on scope 2 emissions just like that. So there's always something we can do that's positive. And a lot of people think that they're the only ones struggling. I speak monthly with the big side of town in Perth, and even the big companies who have been doing a lot of ESG reporting for many years, a lot of them are also struggling with the new mandatory climate reporting. Now, what you'll see today is there's limited resources, so there are going to be trade-offs, like where do we spend our money? And for that, we're going to have to look at our most important and meaningful impacts, and that's where we need to remember to put our money. And one might think, I always struggle with the trade-off when I'm trying to recycle plastic, because I hate using hot water to wash the plastic before I put it into the recycling bin. So water use and then recycling plastic, I know that there's a lot of trade-offs. And we're going to also see that when we talk about climate, because if we, for example, having solar panels, we've just got to be careful that we don't also destroy the vegetation underneath to go put those panels, for example, in the desert. But that doesn't mean that we do nothing. Okay, so although it's a lot of trade-offs, a lot of complexity, there's always something that we can do. And that brings me to the fourth last point, which is to please celebrate the wins. That's what my boss, Jack Burt, always says, is no matter how big or small, we all need to celebrate those wins. And a lot of people these days say, oh, you can't, there's no more low-hanging fruit. Of course, there's some low-hanging fruit. There's something we can do right now, like, for example, if we all go and delete 10 emails, then it doesn't have to be kept on stored in all those big data storage centers forever. Okay. And
Hey,
remember,
Lindy.
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt. I
yes.
just wondered, we have the results of the poll if you
Ah,
they're in
would
the
love to
chat.
hear. Can you maybe
So
tell us about that?
yeah, so it looks like with most people are either working in sustainability or social science with 32% each. Actually, the poll is changing by the minute. We have people from communications, that's 8%, only 2% in accounting, which is interesting. No legal, and actually 11% whose work isn't related, but they're interested in the topic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Lovely to know who's in the room. So we've all heard about talking the talk and actually walking the talk. So although we're going to be talking about ESG or sustainability reporting, let's not lose sight that it's the actual practice that we're really interested in. We're trying to make our organization or our household more aware of the environmental and societal impact of what we do. So let's always just remember it's the authentic walking the talk that I hope we're all aiming for. So this word sustainability, it's not like the English word. It's got a special meaning that was born in 1987 through the World Commission on Environment and Development Brundtland Commission report. Because at the time, the UN used to talk about economic growth, and it was just growth upon growth of the economy. And people said, hang on, we don't have endless limits where we can just grow and grow and grow. We should strive for sustainable development. So that's development in the world that meets the needs of the present without compromising our future generations' ability to meet their own needs. So this diagram was the first conception of sustainability, which means when we're making economic decisions, we should also be thinking about the societal and environmental impact of those decisions. So bearing that in mind, economy, society, environment, and trying to consider all of those brings us to many words which over time we've been using, such as PPP, CSR, ESG, triple bottom line, which I know people have done PhDs on the subtle differences between these, but at the moment it's kind of used quite interchangeably. And just to be more clear, I find ESG, meaning environmental, social governance management, plus the extra E from the previous slide, which is economy, coming back to here, the economy. I quite like that, just to say what we're actually talking about, and never be embarrassed to think that, of course, finances are important. When we're thinking ESG, of course, we're trying to also stay alive as a business or as a charity. The finances are important, but we're also just talking about environmental impact, social impact, and the governance, meaning, are we behaving well as a corporation, obeying all the rules, etc.
Lindy, I'm sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. Would you mind please turning your screen to slideshow mode, just because the slides are a little small?
Oh, thank you so much.
That's okay. I believe you can go at the top of your PowerPoint. It says display settings, and oh,
so the top is expectable.
the top of your PowerPoint. I think it's display settings. Hang on.
Oh, there we go. Display.
Yeah, just there. If you swap to, yeah.
And go to what? This one. Swap presenter view and slide view.
Yeah.
Not intuitive.
Good?
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Perfect.
Thank you so
thank
much
you.
for that.
Perfect.
Okay, so when we're trying to think what does ESG include, it's really useful to go to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which a lot of companies and universities, for example, UWA, where I work, they talk about what they're doing in their business and how it aligns with these 17 global goals, with all the targets that go behind it. So it's really worthwhile looking at the SDG website, because there's a lot of interesting targets that go behind these 17 pictures. Again, if we're trying to think what do we mean by sustainability reporting, we looked at 200 large global companies, and these were the sort of categories that we saw when we were hand collecting the KPIs that they were talking about. So they were talking about, for example, percentage of female executives, the percentage of customer complaints, etc. So if we just consider the history of sustainability reporting, it's not new, but I must admit, I've been interested in this for 20 years, but only in the last 4 years have a lot of other people that weren't before interested become interested, and it's probably because of the move globally to make ESG reporting mandatory. And in Australia, we're not making all the ESG reporting mandatory at this stage, like the Europeans are. What we're making is we're looking at climate first, but not climate only. So at the moment, the big side of town, the large companies, whether they're public or private, are getting ready for mandatory climate-related reporting that will begin next year. Yeah, I've got a slide of the exact start dates for the difference. But we're just waiting for that to go through the legal process to see exactly when that's going to start in Australia. So if we look back here at 1987, that was when the term sustainability was coined, sustainable development. And then importantly, in 1997, the Global Reporting Initiative was formed. And that even today is the most popular amongst large global companies as a tool to know how to do your ESG reporting. So if any of you are starting or trying to improve your ESG reporting, the free Global Reporting Initiative has stood the test of time, and it helps you to find your most important impacts that are the ones that we should consider measuring and managing. So in 2014, it was actually the Europeans that began this trend of sustainability reporting moving away from being voluntary to being mandatory, because they started with their non-financial reporting directive in 2014. So if you think about it, that's only 10 years ago. And at that stage, they didn't ask for a lot of mandatory ESG reporting, just a little bit, but they've subsequently changed. So then we see in 2015 the Paris Agreement about how to manage carbon emissions. And in 2016, we've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then importantly, business got together in 2017 and started taking the disclosure of climate very seriously with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And those recommendations actually form what we now are busy adopting in Australia as our first mandatory climate standards for large public and private companies, and also government institutions also, you'll see just now, use this as a baseline for their climate-related reporting. And then things went crazy in the green. Since 2021, the accountants put their hat in the ring, because they usually the accountants normally do proper accounting, but they're very good at standard setting and at putting systems in. So although accountants can't do it alone, we need the scientists, we need the people with understanding of the legal and the social and the biological. When the accountants joined in the standard setting ring for sustainability in 21, you saw the whole world start to look for power. You saw where there were 50 different sustainability reporting voluntary frameworks, you saw people trying to hedge their bet and join into groups to try and become the global standard setters of the world. So what happened in 21 is the accountants in Australia, we follow the International Accounting Standards Board on the left, but on the right, they formed a sister board called the International Sustainability Standards Board, and that is what Australia is following for climate. So out of all those different sustainability reporters, we now have the four big ones. There were a lot of consolidations. So EFRAG are the Europeans, and they're really ahead of us. They've already got us a full set of sustainability reporting standards, and that is mandatory for large companies. We following the bottom left, we following the IFRS, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which I call the accountants. And then on the right, we've got the GRI, which is the longest standing and most popular framework. And I really do think it's a good one if you're beginning your process and also continuing your process. It's definitely part of your process, even if you have to do mandatory standards under, for example, the accounting IFRS. And then we've got the Americans, the SEC, who've had a lot of trouble. There were even some people wanted to sue them when they tried to bring in climate standards, which they have managed to do. So we've got those four global standard setters now. We'd like to just have one, but there's still four, and they have some very important differences between them. And I don't know if any of you have heard of double materiality, impact materiality, financial materiality. Okay. Now, this is a very important concept because it tells us what needs to be in our sustainability reporting, what is important enough to be in our sustainability reporting, and people have different philosophies on how to determine that. The GRI and others, they follow impact materiality. So they say something should be in your sustainability report if it's a significant impact of your organization on the environment or society. Whereas the accountants go for the middle one, which is to say that something's important enough to manage and report on if an environmental or social issue impacts the prospects of the company. So for example, if climate change causes the useful life of a truck to shorten, that is an impact on the company. Whereas the last one is called double materiality, which is what the Europeans adopt. And that says that something can be important enough to be reported and managed if either of the above hold, inward or outward. Now, because the whole world is obsessed with the climate reporting as the first but not last mandatory reporting, I really want you to say with me, B, burn, buy, beyond, to understand these greenhouse gas emissions, which everyone's very worried about at the moment, to try and measure. So burn is scope 1 emissions. So it's the fuel that your trucks are burning. It's the fuel that Qantas's aeroplanes are burning. That's scope 1. Buy relates mainly to electricity. So if UWA, that's one of our biggest, is scope 2, our buying of electricity. So when your children or your sister don't turn off the lights, tell them you should be saving scope 2 emissions. Then the one that's giving everyone gray hairs is beyond, which is scope 3. So scope 3 looks not only on your suppliers, but also on your customers, and it looks at the carbon emissions caused and related to you in your whole value chain. So for example, if you buy something from a supplier, scope 3 wants you to estimate what are the carbon emissions associated with the supplier making that product that they're giving you. Scope 3 also says if you sell your product, what happens to it at the end of its life? What are the carbon emissions at that point? So please remember B as you look into your greenhouse gas emissions, which is often an important first step at the moment because everyone's needing to know greenhouse gas emission data because it's becoming mandatory for the big players. And the problem for the little players is that if the big players have to report on scope 3, it means they need to ask their suppliers and their suppliers for those people's scope 1 and 2 emissions, because those smaller companies' scope 1 and 2 emissions form part of the big companies' scope 3 emissions because they're in the value chain. So that's why what we're seeing is a lot of people, when they're buying from a supplier and they're looking to judge which supplier to get, they're taking into account, can you provide me with your scope 1 and 2 emission data? So I know not everyone's interested in doing carbon accounting, but it is interesting just to know, why do we have these carbon dioxide equivalents, CO2 equivalents? It's because they're different greenhouse gas emissions and we want to measure them just as one type, which is the CO2 equivalents, because else we're going to be talking about methane and all different ones. So in this simple example, if you are taking the amount of fuel that you're using in your trucks, that would be your activity data. So you need systems in place for that. You then get those wonderful scientists to give you a blue conversion factor, and that will give you the amount of that type of greenhouse gas, whatever it was that you're measuring. And then you take the first pink measurement and then you times it by the global warming potential factor, which again the scientists provide to us, and that converts every different type of greenhouse gas to the one which is the carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's just something to remember, because quite honestly I used to think that the scientists actually have little proper little measurements of greenhouse gases, but actually there's a lot of estimation involved. So those numbers are not perfect, and a lot of people are trying to put in systems in how to measure them. So I'm not going to go into too much about those 4 powerhouses. Remember, the first one are the accountants. And what's coming through in the accountants' sustainability standards are these 4 pillars in green. So whatever the topic is you're dealing with, if it's climate or biodiversity, etc., they're saying, what's the governance around that topic? What's the strategy? What's your risk management, and what's your metrics? So those are the 4 pillars which you'll see talked about a lot. The GRI, wonderful set of standards, which we could talk about for another day, but I'm not going to do that today. The Europeans, the third powerhouse, they've got their full suite of standards. They don't just have climate like the accountants, they've got everything. And then the poor SEC, they really struggled, but they did manage to get in a climate rule. But of course, California, they're having no trouble getting in their climate rule. So bringing it back to Australia, as I said, we've got, at the moment, there's a lot going on. We've got wonderful environmental laws, and we've got wonderful social laws in our country. But as far as public disclosure reporting to the public, we've now got this first bullet point, which is this exposure draft standard relating to climate, which follows the global accounting standard from the International Sustainability Standards Board. We've also got the Modern Slavery Act, where large companies have to talk about how they're mitigating modern slavery in their whole supply chain. And in case you're wondering who's got to report under the mandatory climate reporting, we could go into this, but these are just the thresholds of the companies who have to report on climate. But remember, it not only affects them, but it also affects their supply chain if they want to ask their suppliers and suppliers for scope 1 and 2 data. They can just estimate it, but they might be asking people for that. If you're a government organization, they're also looking at, so we've got this lovely diagram here. On the left, we've got the companies, and on the right, we've got the Commonwealth government institutions, and they're also probably going to follow that same standard for climate-related disclosure. Now, let's get to what you're probably more interested in, which is the process of sustainability reporting. And this is just where we just need to again remember what we spoke about in the beginning about progress over perfection, etc. So this is not a linear process. So you don't start at one point and then just go ahead. You might start at a different point, but I'm just trying to bring some steps that you can consider. So the first thing is go back to your organization's mission, vision, and strategies. Whatever we're going to do regarding ESG, we need to remember what's going on as our main mission, vision, and strategies. We also need to remember that different companies have different risk appetites. So some people, maybe their mission is just to make so much money and they don't care if they could potentially get into trouble by doing something wrong to the environment. That's because they've got this risk appetite that they, so we must just think about the company's risk appetite, and we cannot do everything in ESG. We have to look at the most important things for us to do because we don't have the resources to do everything. So let's make our money count, our money and time. So step 2 is still just trying to get your head around in your own organization. And what I find fantastic, what's happening at the moment, is people are sharing knowledge on ESG. There's so much beautiful information out there that everyone's sharing. They're realizing this isn't supposed to be a competition. This is supposed to be everyone making an improvement. So I just like to draw your attention to a couple of things, like item 8. Consider who you've got in your business. You know, like you often have some great expertise within your company that you're not even realizing. You might have someone who's a great HR communications expert or media expert, or you might have someone who's very good at the legal side. We need multidisciplinary teams to develop our approach to ESG. So let's not forget about that. Also, item 9, your position in the supply chain. Maybe you supply a big company and maybe they can also provide you with some help with your ESG, because by them helping you, they're also going to be helping themselves. So step 3, and I think this is one of the important steps, is to consider your resources. Okay, so I really do recommend GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. The universal standards, which are 1, 2, 3, help you to find your most material impacts that you need to focus on. They're wonderful webinars. I've put a BDO webinar here. Even if you don't need to do greenhouse gas accounting, I recommend that you just watch those webinars just to understand what's involved. And then I think I'm just going to go on to the next one, which is these 4 pillars that came up originally in the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and have now been put into the global climate standard. Those 4 pillars make a lot of sense no matter what sort of business you are. So if you first just consider ESG as a whole and you say, okay, well, who's in charge of that? What's our governance structure? Like, do we have people on the board who are in charge of ESG? You'll see that coming more and more in the last 5 years. Who are the managers of ESG? We didn't used to have so many sustainability managers, but now the importance of sustainability managers is really important. And some people, you might just be a small company and maybe someone puts you in charge of the ESG. Then your strategy. What's your overall strategy? Are you trying to just get by? Are you trying to just comply with what's expected? Or do you want to make this as a point of difference? And then let's not forget that ESG, they are topics that fit with other topics that we need to manage in our business. There are lots of worries, and ESG are part of the overall risk management process. And then, of course, we're going to need some metrics and targets for those items of ESG that we think is worthwhile managing and measuring. So one of the most important parts is stakeholder engagement, talking to people in your business and outside of your business to try and find out what is the most significant impacts of your company on society and the environment, and what are the most important, not climate, Freudian slip, environmental and social issues out there that impact on your business's prospects. So I really do recommend we just use double materiality to try and pick out those topics that we need to manage. So let's not fool ourselves. If our business doesn't have a big impact on something, don't spend all your money and time on that. Spend it on what matters, because that's being authentic and that's helping your business and also broader society. So once we've determined our most important topics, if you go look at, say, Woolworth's annual report, you'll see they list their most important topics, maybe 10 of them. So if we've got a particular topic, like say food safety, you're a producer, you don't want to kill people with the food you're making. For each topic, you can use those 4 pillars as a sensible way of approaching it. So first of all, governance, you know, who's in charge of this? Who's managing food safety? What's our strategy? What's our risk management process? Does it form part of our company or our organization's overall risk management process? And what metrics and targets do we have for each of those different topics? So that's a very straightforward approach of just starting to talk about it. We don't have big systems in place yet. The next part is trying to slowly, step 7, slowly develop our data capture systems for our most important topics. And then you can see step 8's only where we start to report, and we're going to decide which aspects do we have to report on if it's mandatory, or which aspects do we want to if it's voluntary. So these steps, as I say, aren't linear, but they are just things for us all to think about, and we are not alone. So I do go back to that first slide. Everybody's struggling with this, but the wonderful thing is everybody's sharing knowledge on it and helping each other and saying what's working or not working. So you are not alone. And I think I'll stop there and ask for some comments if you'd like to share something, or if you'd like to anything else, if you'd like to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Lindy. That was amazing. And what struck me as a newcomer to this world is I'd always assumed it was something kind of being imposed on people, but actually you've really made it clear that there's a lot of agency required and decision-making power and even creativity that organizations need to take on board and be proactive. And you've also shown us the culture around it, which is about, you know, making a contribution and being able to reach out to each other. So that was really enlightening. I hope that people have some questions. You can either please jump in or be alert to your microphones going off. Oh, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Lindy. That was great. So I'm interested in this division between the mandatory and the non-mandatory and how that is coming into ESG reporting. So let me take that last example, which was food safety, which I think potentially mandatory in terms of health regulations. But food insecurity wouldn't be mandatory. So to what extent does a major supermarket have to take into account, or should take into account, or does report about the impact that they can have or should have on food insecurity, including hunger in their local community? So to what extent are we seeing non-mandatory ESG reporting? You mentioned Modern Slavery Act is mandatory for companies of a certain size, but other kind of social issues will be non-mandatory. So to what extent are we seeing the non-mandatory element coming into ESG reporting?
That's a fantastic question. And you also highlighted something else, which is that we've got like a real multi-pronged approach here. We've got wonderful laws in our country. We've got lovely environmental and social, human laws in our country, which have to be obeyed. Like you say, food safety, like environmental compliance. Now, when we're talking about sustainability reporting, we're not talking about the reporting that we have to do to government about things like compliance with the laws. Like you've got to report to government potentially on how you're treating your water before you put it into the environment and stuff. We're talking about, with sustainability reporting, what we're actually telling the public. So what you said earlier is that we've got some stuff that we've been having to do for regulation anyway, which could be food safety. We've then got a choice whether we want to bring that into our sustainability reporting to the public. And that's all to do with our stakeholder engagement and seeing what stakeholders would like to know about us, and also what our biggest potential impacts on society and the environment. So I think what you've highlighted is that there's the legal requirements and systems that companies need, because else they'll be shut down by, for example, the departments of environment and stuff. And they've got reporting requirements to those government departments. But what we're talking about is public reporting, which, okay, so for that, for the last, since, for many, many years, the large companies have been doing voluntary public reporting of a selection of KPIs, key performance indicators, some of which might have also had to be shown to government departments, but they've chosen what they want to report to the public. Right now, in our country, the only thing we have to do is for large, well, we don't have to do it yet from next year, is on climate to the public, but people still do a lot of ESG reporting, even in their annual reports, which used to, like 15 years ago, be mainly just financial statements and a lot of financial talk. So there is a lot of voluntary reporting, but funnily enough, sometimes when people are doing good things, they don't want to talk about it because they don't want, for example, people to start criticizing them. So sometimes, even if you're doing something good, they don't actually talk about it in voluntary reporting. We found that in some of the interviews we've conducted.
Thanks, Paul. And Lindy, there's a sort of related question from Rebecca Cutter. I don't know if Rebecca's around to ask the question. So I'll read it. She works, I think, as in a not-for-profit, so the company is exempt from mandatory reporting. She's just wondering if she'd likely to be drawn into the scope 3 kind of level, and would they have to sort of actually be reporting on that one day? I think that was
great question. The cool thing about scope 3 is that there's different levels of accuracy. So a big company's scope 3, they can either ask you as a supplier to tell them your scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas computations, or there's another way that those big companies can do it, and they can just estimate it based on how much they spend on you. So that's a real rough estimation. So to answer your question, I have heard that a lot of those big companies would like to get their scope 1, 2, and 3 more accurate. So for scope 3, they are asking their suppliers to put in systems or to start measuring some basic stuff like how much liters of fuel do you use, or how much electricity do you use, which you can then tell your buyer. So as a charity, I think it's going to be a question of really just engaging with those people and talking to them and asking what they would like to see you do. And everyone's struggling, and even people like Woolworths, they talk about in their annual report, they talk about working with a couple of big first tier suppliers at the moment. So even they are struggling to get information out of their big tier 1 suppliers. So it's not going to happen like overnight for you, but it is good just to remember what scope 1 and 2, probably for you, it will probably be scope 2, which is electricity. So maybe you just want to start recording electricity as a start.
Thanks, Lindy. I'll prioritize people with their hand up. So we'll go to Greg for a question.
Thanks, Lisette. Lindy, thank you very much. Very interesting. I've learned a lot over the last 45 minutes from you, so very grateful. My question is about the development of technology, and specifically the role of technology in measurement in two versions. One is around compliance, to actually keep individuals and organisations honest to their commitments, and also to the mandatory requirements. And then secondly, in a positive sense, I've seen it more in the latter through my role as trustee of the Nature Conservancy, but that's an organisation that is very involved, of course, in sustainability. And so this is not an advertisement, but particularly in terrestrial carbon sequestration and abatement. but moving eventually into blue carbon and also biodiversity. Technology plays a huge role there, and increasingly so with the geoterrestrial technology involved. But I'm just curious as to whether you've seen any really sort of exemplary uses of technology, or whether you've also seen the way in which technology might be developing to give us a better understanding of actually the way in which particularly our E within ESG is being both complied with, but also hopefully developed in a more positive way.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Completely. There's a lot of positivity, as far as whether it's using drone images to, look at what's going on with the nature, etc., ecosystems, whether it's the Internet of Things where the farmers can know when the soil's dry to turn on the tap or whatever to irrigate. And the data collection, I mean, there's a big race for people to develop good greenhouse gas emission capture type, software and that to make it easier for people like farmers to put in how big the pigs grown this season, because that's going to tell us the greenhouse gas emissions relating to that pig. So it's pretty exciting, the use of technology and also artificial intelligence. And then, on the social side, there's so many advancements. Like, for example, I know in Africa at the moment, they've got these mobile X-ray facilities where they can just on the spot do a scan of your lungs. So it is very exciting, the possibilities there. Thank you.
Thanks. Sheena has a couple of questions. I wonder if she's able to turn her microphone on. Otherwise, I'll go. So Sheena, oh, there you go. Go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I had two questions. One of them has been partially answered by the previous one about not-for-profits. I just wanted to know if there were any mandatory sustainability reporting requirements that NFPs are subject to. And my other question was whether you could tell us more about the differences in reporting scope for the incoming Australian mandatory standards compared to the global standards that they're sort of derived from. That makes sense.
Great questions.
Thank you.
Great questions. We're all waiting to hear how the government agencies are going to handle things, but with their big climate targets that they've already set, there's no ways that they're not going to get involved with climate-related disclosures. Okay, so that's government. That's not what you asked about, which is the not-for-profit, for the actual charities. It's not going to hit you so quickly because of the whole rollout. They're rolling it out to the biggest companies only from next year onwards. So it's not going to hit you tomorrow. But as far as voluntary reporting goes, I'm seeing a huge uptick, like even UWA. I've been following keenly the great work our sustainability reporting team are doing. And universities are starting to put out ESG information because that's what our students and probably staff want to know about. So for you as a charity, I think, they would like to hear more. I mean, you already do a lot of impact reporting, but I think it's worth just keeping your eye on and thinking of perhaps starting to have a few recording processes of things like your electricity use and that, and just considering that as you do it. And then your second question, what was it again? I'm going on and on.
Thanks for that, Lindy. It was about the incoming Australian mandatory reporting standards and sort of how that scope of reporting compares to the global standards and what they require. If there are any
great.
differences.
Thank you. Okay, so what we've got in our country is only climate. So in the exposure draft, they took the global accounting, from the accountants, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, they took just the climate standard because those global accountants have also put out a general sustainability standard, which we in our country decided not to touch. We only decided to use the climate standard in the exposure draft. And then we follow that pretty closely. There are a couple of differences. For example, they want us to use the national greenhouse gas reporting methodology, which we've been using for many years in our country to measure the big scope 1 emitters, which differs from what the global standard requires, which is the global greenhouse gas protocol, which is used and by many other standard setters, which does result in a bit of a different way of reporting. So I'm not sure if they're going to change that or not when it comes to the final, the one we're going to adopt, whether the feedback. I've also heard that the fact that we're not going to actually mandate the general sustainability standard, which also follows those 4 pillars, some people are calling out for that to still be voluntary in our country, which would be a good thing, to at least make it a voluntary requirement, I suppose. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for the answers.
Thanks.
Is Amy around? There's a question from Amy.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I was just wondering, with TCFD reporting, so I have done TCFD reporting in a previous role, and it was very prescriptive in terms of exactly what questions you were answering and the information that you wanted to give. And I was just wondering if we know under AASB, how are we to present the data? So is it similar to that where you're kind of answering a questionnaire, or is it more open-ended? Do we know?
Okay, so the one that we're going to be adopting in Australia is based on the TCFD, so it's fantastic that you're across that. Generally, the way standards work with the International Accounting Standards Board and the International Sustainability Standards Board is very principles-based. So it's not like the Americans that are rules-based.
Yeah.
But I think all your knowledge and all those questions that you answer from the TCFD is completely applicable. And yeah, they've got the standard, and they also specify exactly what they want to know. They ask it one by one, so I think you're going to be very familiar, which is great. We need more people like you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Is there any other questions or comments? Lindy, I was going to ask if you had or wanted to offer any examples of a company that's doing it well, or a case study, or is there something we can read of like best practice approaches or something interesting?
Yeah, that's a good one, because I actually forgot to mention that another resource is always just to look what other companies are doing. If you're trying to do your own sustainability reporting and trying to think what's important, what are the topics that are material and important, it's good to look at other people in your area, whether it's in our country or abroad. I personally have always enjoyed Woolworths reporting. I've always found it very easy to relate to. I enjoy them. And then I recently actually was looking at Rio Tinto's reporting, surprisingly enough, sometimes. And they're actually doing a pretty good job with their reporting, explaining how they determine their material topics and stuff. So yeah, those are 2 that I've looked at more recently. If you look at their annual reports, there's a lot of information in it. And of course, you've also got the sustainability report, but these days, a lot of that information is summarized in the annual report as well, because investors are interested in it.
Okay, that's good. It's got my curiosity now. So last call for questions. Any other comments? So yeah, Carol will send the slides through so we can have a closer read and follow up on those hot tips for case studies to look at. Lindy, thank you so much for your time today and your patience with explaining just such a complex world in such a sort of sensible and simple way for us to understand. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the comments.
Yeah. And just before we go, it's related. We just wanted to let you know that the Centre for Social Impact does run some outcomes measurement courses. We're bringing this, lens more and more into our courses, even though they're not really about this, but it's just about general outcomes measurement and reporting. And so we are running them in Perth in July, Sunshine Coast in August. Then in September, we go to Broome, followed by Albany in October and Melbourne in November, I believe. So there's lots of different locations you can check out if you want to have a holiday at the same time. Or if you're based in Perth, just come to the Perth one. But we hope to see you there. And also the next public seminar series, we'll have Bill Guy, who is currently the CEO of Community Mental Health Australia, and he's looking at psychosocial need outside the NDIS. So that should be a really interesting topic too. But thank you very much, Lindy, today.
Thank you so much.